Deputy Minister Kodwa, and thank you very much for your very good words of welcome. Newly elected chairman or chairperson of SANEF, I congratulate you. I welcome this opportunity to once again engage with the country's leading editors on matters that are critical to our nation, but more particularly at a time of crisis like the time we are going through now. This engagement is obviously long overdue, and we need to apologize that it has taken quite a bit of time to arrange. We kept having stops and starts, and we keep hoping that we will perfect this engagement with journalists. The willingness is there. We just need to arrange it well enough, and I will be asking Minister Kodwa and Minister Mthembu to actually have a discussion with yourselves on how we can craft it. The suggestion has been made that after I address the nation, as I will next week, on a range of matters, that we should allow for time for questions, but it is so well arranged that people have felt that that may not be the appropriate time. What we should rather do is to allow for questions on another day following or 2 days later. So that is what we're working with. And in relation to having ministers, particularly at a time like this with the economy not performing well at all, in fact, being in a real terrible shape, we should allow our economic cluster ministers to be more available. That we will arrange. I do wish to congratulate, as I said to you, Sbu, the newly elected leadership of SANEF. You said that Mahlatsi Gallens has now become the Secretary General, and that maybe that's something that I should consider after leaving my current position. I have been Secretary General, so for me that will be a move sideways and not upstairs. Having been Secretary General, I know what happens in that type of post. Think of another one, and I'll leave it to you to find another post or role for me. I also wish to pay my respects to those journalists and media workers who have lost their lives to COVID, and to extend my sympathies to their families and to yourselves as a sector, important sector in the body politic of our country. And I'm also at this stage extending my sorrow at the harassment that has been meted out to journalists, some of whom are your members, and you mentioned some names, and clearly there is action that we need to take to continue protecting, defending, and advancing the rights of all our citizens, but also of journalists. So there is work that we need to continue with there. This engagement takes place as government is focused on 3 critical areas. Clearly, the first one is COVID-19. We are intensifying our public health response with a view of further reducing the incidence of new cases across all our provinces. This includes strengthening case identification and contact tracing systems to trace and isolate contacts as quickly as possible. And we're putting in place the mechanisms to be able to do that. We are maintaining the readiness of our health facilities in case of further surges, as other locales in the world have seen surges after a decline. And we are also expecting that we could have sudden surges, but we are maintaining our state of readiness in a number of ways. We're working to prevent this second wave of infections. This includes, of course, encouraging people to maintain prevention measures, the messages that we've been beaming out to people about social distancing, wearing their masks and avoiding gatherings, and regular hand washing as well as sanitizing. We're working with unions and other stakeholders to ensure that frontline workers do receive the support and protective equipment that they need as they continue to do the incredible work that they do to protect South Africans and care for those who are ill from COVID-19. The second issue that we are focused on is the economic recovery. As you correctly said, Sbu, yesterday we received devastating news. You always accuse me of saying that I'm shocked. I wasn't shocked because right at the beginning of COVID-19, I did say that this is going to be a devastating pandemic, and it is going to affect livelihoods, and that the economy of our country would suffer greatly. And so when the news came through yesterday about this 51% downscale, which obviously is annualized, but effectively it will be 16% or so, it was very much in line with what we had expected this pandemic would do. So we did expect that we would have to, having come up with assistance packages twice, that we would need to come up with a recovery program or plan. Right now, we are working closely with social partners in NEDLEC on a common agenda for economic recovery, which will help to feed into government's economic recovery strategy. We have had to do this, much as a number of people said, go ahead and just come up with a recovery strategy. We've had to do this because our partners, social partners, have all come up with a number of ideas, and wonderful ideas, I might add, from the business side, from the union side, from community. And so government has had to engage with all these social partners, and we've got this fantastic platform, which is NEDLEC, which enables and allows us to be in conversation. And I met them initially, and I gave them 3 weeks that they should present a plan to me. They've been working at this. They needed another week extension. So that is now being, if you like, panel beaten into shape. There is broad agreement on the key elements of the plan, including the key priorities, clearly delineated objectives, the key priorities that we need to focus on to give effect to recovery, and what we now need to do going forward. Implementation has been highlighted as the key area that we must focus on. But some of the key elements of it is infrastructure investment. And we are pleased that we've been able, through the Infrastructure Investment Office in the Presidency, we've been able to identify key projects across all our provinces that we can embark on. And some of them are shovel ready, and some of them, are almost ready at the press of a button very shortly, and they will create quite a number of jobs. But we've also been working on a mass employment type of program and also focusing on reforms, the economic reforms that we need to embark on. So on the economic side, I think we will be able to come up with actionable plans on a number of fronts. We are improving the implementation of several areas of our 500 billion economic and social relief package. This includes, obviously, the wage support through special UIF TERS scheme, expanding the reach of the loan guarantee scheme. And I must say, and I'm sure you will ask questions in this regard, there have been some problems and issues about the 200 billion rand guarantee scheme, which I have said needs to be resolved so that the scheme is able to achieve the objectives that we set out for it. And we also have been making progress with regard to the special COVID grant, that it reaches those people that need it. And the third area that we've been focusing on is the issue of corruption. There is an intense focus on detecting and prosecuting COVID-related corruption and improving transparency in procurement. And I've often said that we must look out for some silver linings beneath this COVID-19 cloud. And one of those would be, from now on, when it comes to procurement, we need to have transparency, the type of transparency that will enable our people to know what the money that they pay in taxes is going to be used for, so that we are able to rid our country of procurement corruption and put in place a number of measures and schemes that will enable us to reach that goal. Now, the processes around corruption are being undertaken by the SIU, by SARS, and all the agencies working together in what we've called the Fusion Center, in order to promote transparency and accountability. We have published the details of all COVID-related procurement in public entities. And when we set up a cabinet committee, some people thought that we were setting it up to investigate, but we were setting it up to collate all that has happened from a COVID procurement point of view in all government departments and all entities. And that, under the leadership of Minister Lamula, has happened, and further reports are going to also come through. And much of that information is now available on the Treasury website. We're looking at broader measures to tackle corruption in general, from strengthening and better resourcing existing law enforcement agencies to establishing a permanent multidisciplinary entity to ensure more effective detection and prosecution. Now, this engagement with yourselves is taking place as the country is having to once again confront the challenge of gender-based violence and femicide, which has reared its head in the most ugly way in our country. That is the other fourth area that we're focusing on. And at the cabinet level and at the NCCC level, we've discussed it extensively and want to strengthen the resolve of the women of our country, which has been put together in the National Strategic Plan, but that we as government need to do much more than what they have crafted in the National Strategic Plan. And so we will be focusing on that as well. But of course, the other challenge that we're facing is the issue of racism. Racism continues to rear its head in our country, where the basic human rights of sections of our population are being degraded and undermined. Much as we have made significant progress over the last 26 years in building a non-racial South Africa, and we've taken a lot of actions, but there are a few who are seeking to take us backwards. As a country, we must take a firm and unyielding stance against all forms of racism, whether they happen in broad society, in a party, or in an organization, or in a community. We've got to take a clear stance, because having been subjected as a country and as a nation in all our diversity to the ravages of racism, we cannot and must not allow the gains that we have made in this regard to be taken away from us. And since this engagement is intended as a dialogue, I will end my remarks here and deal with the detail on these and other pertinent issues during questions that you are going to pose. But as I said, I'm really delighted that we can have this moment, and I'm sorry it has taken this long. My willingness to engage with yourselves as editors and beyond you with the other journalists is firm, and I'd like to do that because we've got to demonstrate our accountability. But then again, from your questions and comments, we always learn a lot. I always learn a lot, and I pick up a lot of ideas and suggestions. You may be surprised by this. And so in the dialogue, as you pose questions, you may also want to make proposals, because you have the vantage position of spending most of your time having a much more globular look at what is happening in our nation. So it is a pleasure and a joy to be conversing with you, and thank you very much for affording me this opportunity to be with you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thanks very much for those remarks. I see that members have not raised their hands in the participants board. But however, maybe I should allow the new leadership to provide leadership on these questions. Shall I ask the chairperson, Sbu, to ask for the first question? The second question asked by Ms. Nwabisa Makunga and Adrian Passon. Those first three questions to the president. Over to you, Sbu, in that order.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Can we allow the members to go first with the questions, and then I'll ask my question perhaps towards the end as we close off, with your permission.
I accept your leadership, my leader. May we allow Ms. Makunga?
Sure. Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. Mr. President, thank you so much for this opportunity. You speak obviously about corruption, which we all know is quite a pressing issue in our country at the moment. And I think a lot of people, you probably share the frustration. A lot of people in South Africa are really kind of wondering what is happening, particularly with people who are being investigated and people who are politically exposed. When are we actually going to see, prosecutions happening? Now, I'm not suggesting, Mr. President, that you will be the prosecutor, but I would like to understand, if there are certain conversations that are happening, if you don't mind sharing, particularly with law enforcement agencies such as the NPA, where you are able to come in and assist as far as capacity is concerned, because I think that's probably the part where you would be able to assist in that regard. What kind of conversations are happening with our law enforcement agencies as far as capacitating them to do what they need to do?
Thanks very much, Ms. Makunga, followed by Adrian Passon, followed by Mzegezeke, in that order.
Good evening, Mr. President and colleagues. Thank you for having us. Mr. President, my question concerns the matter of excess deaths and COVID-19. we have seen quite a disturbing number being reported by the Medical Research Council of excess deaths, now in the region of over 42,000 since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in South Africa. And there is obviously an informed view by scientists, Mr. President, that many of these deaths, even over 50% of them, could be attributed to the COVID pandemic, which would then push up our mortality figure considerably to around 30,000, which will take us to around 500 deaths per 1 million people. Mr. President, are you concerned that your government is taking decisions based on the wrong data, that in fact our COVID mortality rate may be quite higher than the about 15,000 that we currently have formally, and that this is a big issue for you when you have to make decisions about opening up the economy, etc. And following from that, what is your response to the call by the South African Medical Research Council for the Department of Home Affairs and Statistics South Africa to speed up the processing of death notifications so that we have a much clearer picture of the exact number of COVID deaths? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adrian Bassoon. Mr. President, your last question on this round is from Kanita Mzegezeke Handas.
Thank you very much, Susie. Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity. Just two very quick questions. The first, Mr. President, is does your conscience allow for people implicated in corruption to earn salaries from taxpayer funds while their cases may be unending? And these are people from your political party. So they step aside, they don't report to duty, but they'll still earn hefty salaries. Do you agree with that on principle? The second, Mr. President, is the World Health Organization's Director General has labeled PPE corruption as murder. And the Auditor General, Mr. Makwetu, has released a report painting a really devastating picture of corruption, price gouging, but also the fact that, there was shoddy PPE that was delivered to government. As a result, I really want your most visceral thoughts around the matter. How do you even begin to tackle it, and just the shamelessness and immorality of what we saw during the emergency procurement? Thank you very much, Susie.
Mr. President.
Thank you. To the question that Makunga raised, obviously there are quite a number of people who are being investigated right now. Let me start off by saying, when I met all these entities that are in the Fusion Center, I said, I'd like the SIU, which is leading the charge in terms of the investigations of these, to report to me every 6 weeks. They have reported, and they've made considerable progress. And obviously, the investigation is left to them. They must investigate independently. And if there's wrong that has been done, they must prepare all the charges that they can and make sure that the NPA takes up whatever matters, and all the other agencies must cooperate in ensuring that there is a clear case or cases that can be prosecutable. Now, obviously, they also discussed the issue of resources. They have raised question of resources. They are understaffed. They need more people. They need more resources. And we have committed that we will provide them with the resources where those resources are needed, and so that they can speed up their work. So that is as far as my discussion goes with them. For the rest, they must do their work. All I will do is to capacitate them, to strengthen their capability so that they do their work without any fear, favor, or prejudice. And that I've also said to them, they must communicate wherever they have challenges or shortcomings in terms of resources, and they have agreed that they will be able to do so. It is important for us to build institutions and strengthen them. Because once they are strengthened, then they will do their work. They are professionals. They are well versed in the work that they themselves have to do. And they don't need to be taught to suck eggs. They know exactly what to do. I could never even begin to investigate any case, nor to prosecute any case. So it would be a total disaster when it comes to that. But we've got people within our government structures whose job it is to do that. And our function as government must be to strengthen them, to strengthen their hand and make sure that they do the work as well as they should. So that we will do. The issue, Adrian, of excess deaths is a concerning one, and medical or scientists and professionals have been to the National Command Council, Coronavirus Command Council, and they have outlined precisely how this process works, particularly the reporting of deaths, and in some cases, deaths are not reported as quickly as they should. And it is concerning. I am concerned about that, but I do not believe for one moment that we've taken decisions on the wrong data. We've been well advised. We've been so well advised that the Medical Advisory Committee that was set up by Minister Mkhize has 51 professionals of diverse training, experience, and capability. And you've seen sometimes they differ amongst themselves, even in public. And that is the richness of the type of advice that we get, that we're dealing with people who are real professionals and who, as they advise us through the Medical Advisory Committee, we know that we're getting the best advice. And I recall, Madiba always wanted people of diverse views to advise on any issue. The more diverse views that he could hear, the better, because that enabled him to be able to take decisions. And in this regard, we have also got that. We've got real professionals, but so you know, from time to time, we also get, if you like, ancillary bodies that deal with real sort of intricate issues, like actuarial scientists who look and plot the incidence of deaths in a way that ordinarily one may not be able to understand. And they just don't look at the incidence of deaths, COVID deaths that we count. They look much deeper and they extrapolate. And we've listened to them and we've taken their advice as well. So from an advice point of view, I would not say that we've taken advice on wrong data. I think the data has been well advised and well ventilated. And yes, it is possible that the records of people who've died from COVID-related disease could have been a lot more, but we've dealt with those numbers, and there's always a margin of error when you deal with this, but the data, in my view, has been spot on. The issue of death notification, clearly, that has been also one of the challenges, because the death notification takes place through Home Affairs, who, when the medical people certify somebody dead, the certificate finally has to be reported to Home Affairs, and they have a role there. So the death notification process needs to be streamlined, and I think during the period of COVID, we're learning a lot of things that we need to improve on. Juanita, the issue of people who are found to have done wrong and who are suspended and earn salaries. I know, and I've listened to many radio programs, people are appalled that someone who has been suspended for either being charged for either corruption or some form of malfeasance would be suspended and continue earning their salaries. And initially, when we held our press conference, I did say there's the issue of the labor laws, and it's not an issue that one does intentionally. There are the labor laws. As it stands now, I think in many companies and also in government, when you are suspended, for whatever wrong you could have done, it is often, not always, but often suspension with pay. And I know that in this case, the public is appalled at the fact that some people, particularly politicians, could be suspended with pay, and the reaction has been quite negative on that, and you want to know how I respond to that. As an employer in government, when we suspend people, and I had to suspend a director general the other day for an alleged wrong that that person has committed, we suspended that person with pay because that is the rule, that is the done thing, and that is the labor law sort of protocol. So one needs to look at that in that way. And if, for instance, there has to be a different rule for, say, politicians, then that needs to be looked at. But as it is now in your various organizations and in various organizations that even ordinary people work for, the general labor law is that when you are suspended, it is with pay. Now, the concern that I have with this is that sometimes it goes on forever. I know of people who've been on suspension for years and years, and they continue to be paid. Now, that, in my view, is iniquitous, and it should not happen in the way that it has unfolded in other cases. So we need to look at that, and this moment of having people being suspended should enable us to look at it and say, is this the right thing, particularly in view of the reaction of ordinary people? Because in the end, we are accountable to ordinary people. The PPE scandal, as you said, the WHO has said it is murder. And I do take that view as well, because those that have either hiked prices, and in some cases the prices have been hiked up to 800%. And I've often asked myself, what gets into somebody's head that a mask that would ordinarily cost, 2 Rand or 3 Rand is now sold at 90 Rand. That must tell anyone who does that is not only wrong, but that is criminal. It is completely unacceptable. And I subscribe to the view that the WHO has put on it, that this is akin to murder. And including, Juanita, the issue of shoddy equipment or products. That too, where someone, a supplier or manufacturers, manufactures shoddy products and then they are then on-sold onto government, and government pays and sometimes pays in advance. It is plain robbery against government and should not be allowed. And I've always held the view, and I continue to hold the view, that anyone who sells anything to government must not be seeking to make an excessive profit, because the government manages public money. It is people's money. If you are going to sell something to me as an individual and you want to make excessive profit, that is a separate matter, but not when we are dealing with the money that belongs to ordinary people. So that wrong must be brought to an end, and we are hoping that through the measures that we are now going to put in place, we will have drawn a line on the procurement systems, that no more shall we allow procurement systems that will allow this type of excessive profiteering from a disaster such as the one that we're going through now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Shall I request colleagues that those that have asked questions to lower their hands? Adrian and Kanita, I see your hands are still up. Maybe you can come in the second round. Shall I now invite Vuyom Voko? Shall I invite Carol Patton? Shall I invite Diane Hawker? In that order, please.
Good evening, Mr. President. We've been hearing and seeing leaders of organized business, religious leaders, increasingly expressing their frustrations with you in particular. COSATU saying you are confrontation averse, you're negotiating with the criminals, and you don't really walk the talk. We had a cry of Sidigiwe from the Anglican Archbishop the other day, and similar sentiments have been expressed by various business leaders. Now, considering that these are people you often, meet with, what I'd like to know is whether they have actually been telling you in your face just how unhappy they are with you not doing the best that they think you should be doing. And irrespective of your answer to that question, whether you think that their criticism has merit or is simply unfair. And then my second question is on the back of the stats that were released yesterday, the GDP numbers that were released by Stats SA, and with the NEDLAC conversations that you alluded to in your opening remarks, would you say that what you've put on the table in front of civil society, business, and organized labor is the best that your government has been able to put place? And in answering that question, perhaps highlight for us perhaps three key areas that or issues that the government has put forward to date, but also perhaps account for the performance of several of your ministers in areas that you previously identified as priorities, and ICT being one of them, on the back of an ICASA that announced recently that there's been another delay in the auctioning of the spectrum, yet you had identified this area as a priority. Thank you.
Carol?
Sorry. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister and Mr. President. Thanks for the opportunity. Could I just follow up on Kanita's question? You spoke about the Director General who you've suspended. Now, I suspect you're talking about the Director General of Public Works. Now, that director, no, is that not right, Kudi? Anyway, the Director General of Public Works has had an adverse report about him. He's the one responsible or allegedly involved in the corruption around the funerals, the big state funerals, Winnie Mandela's funeral and so on. Now, that report has been around for a year, but he was only suspended a couple of weeks ago. Now, I don't know if you can explain why that sort of thing happens, because obviously then if that's the case, it's going to take years while people sit at home on full pay. And then if I could, I would just like to ask some economic questions. I hear what you're saying, that it's important to consult with the social partners. But there are two things that you really could have done that could have been done, quicker without any consultation. Now, the first one is the ICASA auction, and I mean the broadband auction, and Vuyo just mentioned it. But what do you think of that? Are you satisfied that ICASA has now decided to delay this auction, or is there anything you could have done about it, or you can do about it? And then secondly, we're in an electricity supply crisis. It's strangling the economy. And the quickest way to get megawatts onto the grid is to allow businesses, industry, agriculture to generate their own electricity. Now, the DMRE says no, if they want to do that, they must get licensed. Now NERSA has this entire year, it has given out 5 licenses. So it's puzzling as to why, when you say there's an emergency at a crisis, you still have this regulatory environment which is so slow and which is bogging down the economy. Thanks.
All right. Good evening, Mr. President, and to the other colleagues on the call. My question is relating to the two of the priorities which you mentioned, Mr. President, as part of the government's priorities, one being the fight against gender-based violence and the second being the fight against corruption. And I'm sure you would know that the process of state capture doesn't only involve the looting of the state, but also the hollowing out of important public resources that would actually be able to aid with these types of fights. Just a month or so ago, the NPA had told Parliament that the NPA simply doesn't have the kind of resources that it needs to fight the corruption that is already on the books, and this excludes any of the PPE matters that have now arisen. So my question is, are you confident, considering that you are talking quite tough on corruption, that those who need to act on it have the appropriate resources to be able to actually do their jobs, considering that they have said that they do not?
Your Excellency, Mr. President.
Thank you, Vuyo, about the frustrations that people have expressed. I'm aware of those frustrations, and some of them are frustrations that are borne out by people who expect dramatic action. For instance, and I've been asked this repeatedly, when are you arresting all those people who have been involved in corruption? When are you putting them in jail? When are you prosecuting them? And I have, on a repeated basis, said, my task is to strengthen the organizations that should do their work. And I've repeatedly said, the day you have a president who will go out and arrest people, prosecute them, and jail them, you should run for the hills. And that is where the sharp end of the frustration has been. And that is where people have said Sitikiwe, because they have been frustrated by the slowness of some of these processes taking place. And yes, they have rightfully been frustrated also by corruption that they have seen growing. And they're justified to be frustrated. And even our colleagues who are involved in those organizations have themselves, as I have expressed my own frustration to them, that when are we going to see movement? They have said, President, the lack of capacity is quite huge. The state capture process hollowed out the capability. The people who were good at their job were marched out. They were dismissed. They were pursued until they left, and some of them were compromised. And as a result, we are where we are today, where the system has been so weakened. And what we are now seeking to do is to strengthen that system. From SARS, which had been weakened, we're strengthening it to the NPA and a number of other institutions. We've come from a situation of almost like a capability or incapability war zone. And we are trying to rebuild. And inevitably, Vuyo, all these things, as they don't happen, will rest on the head of the president. That why are you not putting this one in jail? Why are you not acting in this way and that way? And what I have said is that as some people have seen action now being done, and they have come back to me and said, we can now see what you've been working on. And I say, history will absolve me, because the determination to put things right is there. And we may be moving at a slow pace, and we may be moving at a pace where people, want faster movement. But we are painstakingly putting things right. And even my colleagues, my comrades in COSATU, and even people in the churches, when we sit down to talk about the processes we're involved in, they often say, yes, we see what is now being done. And I think we've now reached a stage where the change that we've all wanted to see will start unfolding. It has been a slow burn, it's been slow in happening, but we are going to see change. And I often say that it's irrevocable. We are going to see change. And of course, there will continue to be those forces that resist the change, and they will seek to put the brakes on, because those who have benefited from the state of incapacity, dysfunctionality, will continue to want to benefit. And our resolve is that we must bring about change. And sometimes it will move slowly, but it will gather momentum. And it is gathering momentum. It will move ahead. So you want to hear whether it has merit or no merit. Yes, people get frustrated. But when we do finally sit down and explain precisely what our strategy is, what our plans are, people get to say, I see where you're going to. And sometimes they even say, now we see what you've been working on. And that's exactly where we are. Is the package that we're putting forward the best? Of course, the government will always try to put its best foot forward. But at the same time, we've got to be in conversation, dialogue with our colleagues. And some people see a weakness in this. Sometimes even those who themselves, like, the business community will say, we've come up with a plan, it must be implemented. It doesn't work like that. We've got to be in dialogue with all our social partners so that all of us, those successful countries that have come out of a terrible situation such as the one we're coming out of now, are those that have succeeded in marshalling all the forces to face in one direction. And that's precisely what I am seeking to do, that all of us must face in one direction. We must all bring to bear our capabilities. And by the way, in doing all this, we are going to have to make contributions, all of us. Government is going to have to make some contributions and sacrifices. Similarly, business as well. Labor and all of us have a role to play. And to get that role to be properly put together, we therefore have to be in dialogue. And fortunately, we are basically all agreed on most of the things that we are talking about. Now you want to know what they are. Vuyo, you'll have to be patient a little bit because they are broad. And the broad thing, low-hanging fruit for us is infrastructure. The infrastructure build of our country has been neglected for years. I've said this for the past 2 years, and I continue to say it. We said, when I became president, I said, I want us to put together an infrastructure fund. Admittedly, it has taken long to do so because there had to be a number of conversations between Treasury, DBSA, and so forth. But now we are there, and now we're beginning to move forward. And in doing so, we want to focus on what is doable. And infrastructure happens to be one, mass employment to be another. Yes, including the release of the spectrum, which has been raised as well, which Carol raised, that should the auction of the spectrum not happen quickly. I am unhappy, Carol, so you know, with the delay. And I've spoken to the minister and I said, this needs to be speeded up. We cannot keep the economy in limbo for another 6 months. This needs to be speeded up. March is far too long. And I've said, find ways of getting it done quicker. And when we were at NEDLAC, ICASA also came and they told us a long story about the processes, some of them legislative and all that they've got to go through. And I put a case to them. I said, can't you move quicker? And as we got into COVID, we said, release the spectrum now on a temporary basis, because in dealing with COVID, we've got to have that connectivity capability. And I'm hoping, because I'm not happy with the time they've put forward, I'm hoping that the time will be shortened because our economy needs the release of the spectrum. The auction must take place so that we move on. Carol wants to know why all these delays. And the delays in getting some of these people either suspended or disciplined are given rise to, Carol, by our own system of labor legislation and protocols and processes. And yes, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the reports have been in place for too long and they haven't been actioned. And so, you know, some of the people, once you start taking action against them, they immediately resort to legal action to their lawyers because they believe that they have done no wrong. And then that process itself takes a long place. I would like to see a much shorter process of dealing with these matters so that we can bring much more confidence without the confidence being underpinned by or being undermined by all these delays that should happen. When it comes to energy, yes, we've got to address the energy process. And yes, we've agreed that there should be self-generation. And there's a regulation that says it's got to be licensed. Now, that is in our laws, that is in our regulation. That is something that needs to be looked at. And it is part of the process of looking at the regulatory environment. Because we agree that, and we agreed much earlier that, yes, there should be self-generation. Because Eskom is facing challenges. But then again, we've also agreed that there should be competition. There should be generation that will put Eskom on its toes as well. So it is that regulatory environment that we need to look at and see how best that can be corrected. I've answered the other issue of the hollowing out of resources because one of our priorities in the end, which maybe one did not articulate right from the outset, is to strengthen the capacity of the state. The state that we have now has been weakened. And you may recall that when I delivered one of the states of the nation, I put this capacity of the state as number 6. And I revised that and I said it should be number 1, capacity of the state in as far as getting things done. As we now go into the recovery process, we are now going to focus more on implementation. And this is where I want to see the implementation taking place, and it will be directed from the President's office, that all the line departments, there will be coordination, and the implementation must happen from a central point, so that the coordination thereof, rather, from a central point, so that there is proper coordination. And through that, we will be hoping to increase the capacity of the state, because then we focus on our priorities, then we focus on what needs to be done. Thank you, Zizi.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. President. Colleagues, may I request that as we continue to engage the President, we only limit our questions to 1. I see colleagues have a temptation to ask many other questions. If you look at the number of participants that would like to ask questions to the President, we try even not to follow what is on the lead board for the questions, to give as many diverse media houses as possible. So I shall request that we limit our question as much as possible to 1 question. I shall now invite Auntie Sophie Mukwena. I shall invite Mary Papaya. I shall invite Teto Matlakwana. Thank you. Auntie Sophie. We pass Mary Papaya.
Good evening, Mr. President, Deputy Minister. I sit as the chair of the Media Freedom Subcommittee of SANEF. My question, Mr. President, to you is, on Monday you announced 3 significant amendment bills to combat gender-based violence and femicide, considered by some in our country as a pandemic. Are you confident then that the courts and the law enforcement officials are competent to implement these significant aspects pertaining to those bills? And I ask this because you spoke about implementation being centered in your office. What then are the significant resources and the strengthening capabilities that have been pushed in the direction of both law enforcement and the courts, maintaining our picture on the face of women, particularly in rural areas and in informal settlements? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zizi. Good evening to the President. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, but obviously we're limited to 1, so I'll go straight to it. The 200 billion rand loan guarantee scheme, which the President, of course, expressed, has had a couple of challenges or problems in being rolled out. Is it true, Mr. President, that business leaders Colin Coleman and Stephen Kosef came up with the idea and not Treasury, and there was no consensus or consultation with Treasury and other partners about this loan scheme, and that is why you've had this kind of stumbling blocks that you have? Thank you.
Mike Cohen. Mike Cohen. We pass Marianne.
Good evening, Mr. President. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Very briefly, many of the proposals that government seems to have been putting on the table, be that spectrum release, be that infrastructure, be that mass employment programs, have been on the table and have been around for a very long time already. What makes you think, or what makes you hope, that these initiatives will work now? And how will you find the political will, both within your cabinet, but also within your governing party, to ensure that things are being implemented when it gets difficult, like, for example, organized labor opposition to any pay cuts of the public service wage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maren. Mr. President.
Right. From Mary, the gender-based violence and femicide commitment is real. Am I confident that we will achieve our objectives and have the national strategic plan implemented? My answer to that is yes. I've never been more serious about anything more than getting to address gender-based violence and femicide effectively. And that is why I've taken the lead on this matter, and I'm encouraging all other leaders in government to take the lead. It is a serious pandemic. We've got to make sure that the women of our country feel safe, and we've got to implement that national strategic plan. And we will allocate resources to have the plan implemented. We'll strengthen our courts. We're in the process of training judicial officers, prosecutors, and our police. And this is going on. And the good thing about having the council, which is made up of the women of our country, is that they are going to be the monitors and the evaluators, and they will be reporting that certain things are not being done as set out in the National Strategic Plan. But I want us to do more. I want government to do much more. For instance, when I've asked how many houses of shelter, the Tutuzela shelters, do we have, and they tell me the number, and I say that's not enough. We've got to have a shelter in every municipality across the country. And I've said that part of the COVID legacy must be that we should have such shelters throughout the country. And many other processes need to take place. We need to make sure that we also embark on a massive conscientization drive so that the men, both young and old in our country, become much more aware and attuned to the fact that the women of our country have equal rights just like they do. They do not own the women of our country, and the men of our country should not abuse the women. The men of our country should not abuse the women of South Africa through either murdering them, raping them, or beating them up. Those are the important levels that we need to get our men in South Africa to get to. So we've got to have a very strong conscientization process and focus on the boy child as well and on men. And this is a mobilization that will start spreading more and more throughout the country. It is a pandemic that we must address and finally defeat. And all the institutions, the courts, the prosecution service, various NGOs, various organizations need to join hands. And in the end, we want to see men leading this campaign. We want to see men in the forefront, talking to other men, making sure that we implement. We want to see men going to police stations to check whether the kids are in police stations. We want to see men complaining about the way police turn women who've been violated or raped away, because in some cases that still happens. So that is the level of real determination that we need to see in this regard. The 200 billion, there seems to be a number of stumbling blocks, and there are people who say that they came up with the idea, and you know, success has many parents. People will always say, I did this, I did that, I did that. The fact of the matter is that we raised the issue about the assistance that needs to be given to businesses in our country, businesses that employ people, businesses that through the COVID devastation were going to face considerable difficulties. And we said that government would be willing and prepared to guarantee, to stand behind the loans that could be given. Now, my frustration is that the conditions and the criteria that is being applied to these loans is just prohibitive. Many businesses are being turned away, and they're being turned away because they don't meet this criterion set by this bank, set by either the central bank and all that. And I'm saying the criterion needs to be aligned with the moment that we are in. It needs to be aligned with COVID. COVID has devastated many businesses, so we need to assist those businesses, and we need to lower those thresholds and make sure that businesses do succeed. Of course, we are not saying just give money away willy-nilly. We're saying there are quite a number of businesses that need to be looked at in a progressive way, not in a conservative way, in the way that typical banks or banks typically look at applicants for loans. So I'd like to see the criteria reformed or restructured so that more and more businesses can apply. I mean, I think it is scandalous that only 18 to 25 billion of the 200 billion, almost 6 months later, has been allocated. The government is prepared to stand behind this money. We're not saying you should throw money away, but we're saying support the businesses. And if it requires that more skills need to be allocated, yes, in the financial institutions, then that should be so that we're able to give support to businesses more and more. Now, the other question is that these plans, infrastructure, mass employment, the spectrum, you name it, have been there for a long time. Yes, indeed. We've often spoken about these. But now we are saying implementation is the name of the game. When it comes to infrastructure, as I said over and over, that infrastructure is the flywheel that should turn our economy around. We now have an office in the presidency that is driving this, working under obviously the supervision of the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. We're fortunate to have had someone who is both an engineer, attuned person when it comes to governance, who has been a mayor in a metro, who knows how to get things done. And that's where we are now. We're now getting things done. The shovels are moving. And we're going to see more and more of that happening. The structure that we've got at the government level, which is composed, the PCC, which is composed of premiers, which is composed of a number of ministers, which is composed of the mayors of our metro, gets together to look at all the projects. Now, this in many ways is happening for the first time, where we are able to have an aerial view, but more importantly, we also now have the great benefit of having been able to get commitments from financiers, from funders, that go up to 340 billion rand. Now, these are projects that, yes, we've spoken about a lot in the past, that are now about ready to get moving. And it is why we are saying we are pivoting the recovery process on a number of key priorities. And one of them is infrastructure, yes, mass employment. The mass employment one, we got the money allocated, and I insisted that we needed to have 100 billion rand. And we've now got 19 billion in this budgetary cycle that is now going to be allocated to the mass employment project. Now, that is now going to get underway. And the spectrum is now going to be issued. And I know that the level of confidence by many people is pretty low because we've delayed in an inordinate manner to have all these projects done and implemented. But we're now facing a new era, and it is an era of strengthening the capability of the state, of getting things done, and it is going to be implementation after implementation. That is going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I now recognize the following Tandeka. Unfortunately, I don't have your surname. My apologies. Judy Sanderson, Janet Hurd, and again, Mike Cohen, in that order.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you for this engagement, Mr. President. I've been on several sides of the gender violence battle as a journalist and editor and also as a crisis volunteer. But the one thing that hasn't changed over the years is the massive under-resourcing of the frontline workers and organizations that are really agents of change in terms of transforming society from such a patriarchal one that we still have. These are organizations like Rape Crisis, Lifeline, Childline, Power, etc. And what seems to happen when there's a lot of talk at these workshops around gender-based violence is there's a lot of talk about the government structures, which are important to capacitate. But really, why is it that so few resources are being given to the real front line of this battle, which is really these civil society organizations and NGOs that are really doing all the crisis work and are also changing attitudes? And I would have thought that a massive injection of funds and support to these organizations that are already there, running shelters and crisis centers in hospitals and townships and clinics and everywhere, but very under-resourced. Why don't they get the necessary funding and support? Thank you.
I think Tandega is meant to go next. Can we take Mike?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. President, and for giving us this opportunity. Mr. President, can you give us a deadline on when your economic recovery plan is going to be finalized and where the money is going to come from? Will there be more money coming from the government? And secondly, in terms of implementation, are you considering making cabinet changes to speed up the plan in those areas where things are not happening as you would wish them to? Thank you.
I think, Mr. President, you can just take those questions. The Deputy Minister seems to be having a problem on his side.
On the first question, the under-resourcing problem of a number of organizations, Childline and a number of others. And the question is, why don't these organizations get the support? It's a very good question and a fair question. And let me just quickly say that the structure that we've put in place, the council, it is going to be part of their task to look at how best we can resource these organizations. One of the challenges and problems that has been raised over and over again is that the front line, as you correctly say, workers and organizations that are doing the real work should be seen as partners of the government in achieving these goals and objectives that we have. And they need to be resourced, they need to be supported, and that will definitely be the approach. And I'm happy that we've got a national council that is made up of women of our country who are going to be in charge of this process. And when they are in charge, we will be able to follow their lead. It'll almost be like, when we set up SANEF. When we set up SANEF, we were able to get rid of the tension, the strife amongst various organizations, be they community-based, professional, medical, or health, and so forth, political. We brought them all together under SANEF, and they were able to achieve a modicum of a good way of working together, and also to deal with resource allocation. We were able, as we raised funds from various places, PEPFAR, World Health Organization, whatever, and as we raised funding, we're able to make sure that even those organizations are well resourced. So this structure will be able to address that challenge that many organizations are having. And we will make sure that the resourcing does happen because, as I've said, this gender-based violence and femicide pandemic, we've got to address in quite a determined way. The economic recovery plan, what is the timeline? The timeline is soonest. We're really talking about weeks, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, that we need to have finalized this. And I've said this to the social partners who wanted a little bit of extension, that we now need to move forward so that we are able to put the plan to the nation. Where will the money come from? Government has to a large extent run out of money, and we are going to have to cobble money together. But fortunately, some aspects of this recovery plan will be funded through a variety of mechanisms. The private sector will play a key role, government will play a key role, and we will all need, as I said earlier, to put shoulder to wheel to make sure that this recovery plan works. In the end, it is going to be our plan, so all of us will have a role to play, and we will be seeking to galvanize the entire nation together, that we need to work together and also be able to just make everybody realize that, yes, indeed, it is important if we want to achieve these ideals, objectives we've set out in the plan, that we should work together. You want to know if there's going to be changes in cabinet? I don't know. Would you like to see changes? Do you want to suggest to me? Do you want to give me, even if it's a confidential memo in this regard? You're free to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you to SBU for co-chairing and assistance. We seem to be struggling, Mr. President, with colleagues from SABC. We'll try them once more. Sophie Mukwena and Sophie and Tandeka, if you are online, please go ahead and ask your question, followed by SBU Ngalwa. Mr. President, we don't seem to be succeeding to get SABC colleagues. Shall I ask SBU to go ahead, followed by Matlatsi, as well as Janet Heard? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, you've said that you are not shocked at the GDP figures, and I think that everyone did expect that there will be a contraction. But it looks like there's a perception that says that the shock actually for most people comes from the extent of that contraction. And there seems to be a perception that government may have been a bit excessive in implementing some of those restrictions. Do you believe, Mr. President, with a little bit of hindsight, that perhaps as government we could have done things differently in terms of some of the restrictions that were imposed around this time? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zizi, and good evening, Mr. President. And yeah, the Secretary General job is not as fun. Mr. President, I just want to push you further on the comments that you made earlier, saying that the labor laws are what constrains you, and that's why people are suspended and then still getting salaries. But with all due respect, Mr. President, people like MP Bongani Bongo are political appointments. They didn't submit their CVs. Why are we using the labor laws as an excuse? Surely, as a party and as a governing party, you want those that represent best the values of the party to be representing you in parliament. Why are we using labor laws as an excuse for political appointments?
Janet Heard.
Good evening, Mr. President. Just sticking with the theme of the evening, I know we're running out of time. You've admitted yourself that government's ability to overcome the country's challenges have been beset by corruption. You've admitted to quite a lot tonight, saying we're entering a new era, that there will be change. But you also said that it may be slow and the state's capacity needs to be strengthened. So I just want to ask you, like here tonight, can you, with these latest interventions that you're announcing, how can you convince people tonight that it will be different and that this really is a change and that we're going to close the gap of the deep inequities in the country? And in other words, I suppose we're saying, why should we believe you? Time is running out. Thanks.
Thanks, Janet. Can we try once more, Thandeka Kubule?
Zizi, I would like to ask the President to comment on whether our stimulus package was sufficient or not. And now, since a stimulus package has to be new money pumped into the economy, why did we see so little new money in the 500 billion? Not counting the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme, we note that of the 122 billion, only 18% has really been allocated. Now, Mr. President, it all seems woefully insufficient, even though it appeared that it was a large package. When one drills down deeper and looks at it in granular detail, there are a lot of allocations missing. Now, the Brits say with a stimulus package, you have to go big or go broke. Is our 51% contraction an indication that we didn't go big enough and therefore we went broke? And it's an indication that we did not cushion this economy sufficiently, and that we are going to see many years of permanent economic scarring. And Zizi, since we couldn't come through, I'd like to ask another colleague's question, which is that the profound economic crisis induced by COVID around the world has brought back into sharp, intense focus the old economic debate about public goods. And I'd like to know from Mr. President whether he's in agreement with the tabling of a number of things that should be public goods. A COVID vaccine should be a public good. I think all would agree. Data for education at this time, because so many of the mass of the children of the poor were left behind educationally during this time. Public broadcasting arguably should be a public good, and public goods contribute positively to GDP. And we'd like to know whether public goods feature significantly as part of the President's economic recovery plan.
Thank you very much, Ms.
Thandeka. From the SABC. My question is about the COVID-19. Mr. President, there's a challenge. The developed nations, particularly the G7, it looks like they are working on the vaccine trials. But the problem here you have a situation where it looks like those powerful nations are pushing to nationalize the vaccine. In other words, the issue of nationalism on vaccine. How are you going to ensure that the poorer countries, particularly the continent, is able to have access to the vaccine should the world be able to come up with one?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We finally were able to connect with SABC colleagues. To you over, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Minister Kodwa. Coming to the question that Sbu raised about the contraction that has been much bigger than what or deeper than what people anticipated. I did expect that it would actually be quite severe. I guess as it has been in many other countries, when one started reading that in countries like the US, 26 million jobs had been lost in just a matter of 2 or 3 months, I knew then that the various countries in the world are going to be adversely affected. But we were in quite a different situation and position because we entered the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, on a weak wicket. Our economy was already severely negatively affected. We had been downgraded by the rating agencies. Our growth levels were already pointing to negative. Actually, we were already getting into a recession. And the pandemic just dealt a double, maybe a triple blow to us. So we were already in a weak state. And many countries around the world did what we did. We did go on a hard lockdown, but so did others. And those that didn't actually experienced much bigger infections. And the good example we often cite is the UK. The infection rate more or less started at the same time for both countries. We had a lockdown, which, yes, was hard. They had a lighter one, and their infection rate just started going much higher. And the problem with that is that they experienced more deaths than we did. Now, with our lockdown, we would like to believe that we did save lives, many lives, in fact. Had we not embarked on the lockdown as we did, I think many more people would have died. And if one does not believe that, one needs to think about the fact that we needed to ready our own health systems that we prepared properly for, were able to come into their own to the point where we had the higher level of recoveries. And that was due to the health systems that we prepared well for during the lockdown period. And that was one of the key objectives of the lockdown. Yes, of course, the lockdown had a devastating impact on our economy. And let me say, even as we did, Sbu, you will not believe how many people, both small business, big business, people in the communities, in the religious sector, kept sending messages as the infection started rising. And they said, President, you've got to embark on a lockdown. And some of them were even editors and journalists. They said, you've got to have a lockdown. And so the lockdown was immensely supported right at the beginning. And for it to be effective, it had to be a total lockdown, which many of our people appreciated. And of course, the longer it took, the more people started having different views. And as it succeeded to lower the infection rate, people felt that, oh no, we actually did not need it. And yet, little did they know that it was due to the lockdown that we were able to save so many lives. And so people then started, paying little attention to the fact that the lockdown was achieving and has achieved the objective it was set for. But at the same time, we also knew that it was going to have this negative impact on the economy, and that is why we came up with this stimulus package. And I'll keep jumping backwards and forwards with a number of questions. And the stimulus package, the initial one was like 1-point-something% of GDP, which was tinkering on the margins. And we realized that the hard lockdown was having a real negative impact on the economy. So we needed to come up with a plan. And we came up with a plan of a stimulus. But remember, we're having a wounded economy. We are in a fiscal bind. Our debt profile is not good. We cannot go out and borrow much more money exponentially at the going interest rates. And therefore, we needed to come up with a stimulus package. And you say, Thandeka says, it didn't have new money. Yes, it did have new money. New money could only be acquired through borrowing because we do not have a surplus. We are in a fiscal bind. And the central bank also came to the party. What was done by the central bank was in large measure also part of the stimulus package to lower interest rates to historic levels. We've never had your repo rate as low as it is now. So it is part of the package. And going for the 200 billion, it is in the end money that it will be government money in the end if it leads to losses. So government has, in a way, said we will guarantee this money, and we now know how guarantees work. I mean, we've guaranteed a number of our state-owned enterprises, SAA and all that, and the guarantees are now being called. And this too will happen. So the payment is postponed, but it is money that government is putting on the table. It may not be immediate, but it is money that could be called, and government will have to live up to it. So the banks are facilitators at the moment. And that is why I say the banks need to loosen the criteria so that we can get businesses to function again. It does not help the economy of our country if businesses are not functioning. So you look at the money that we've had to borrow from outside, that is government, but that is new money that is being put on the table. The money that we got from the IMF, or that we're going to get from the IMF, is new money, borrowed, yes, admittedly, at lower interest rates. The money that we're going to get from the new development bank, the BRICS bank, which, by the way, has been made available to all the BRICS countries. Even China has needed to get an allocation. So that too is new money. Could we have had much more money? Our borrowing levels do not allow us to do that, because otherwise your debt servicing is going to grow exponentially, and we need to look at our debt levels in whatever we do. So we need to have a balance. And the 500 billion, Thandeka, is almost 11% of our GDP. There is no peer country that we know of, our peer country that has done as much as that. We are in the level of your more developed economies that have more capacity in as far as putting out stimulus packages. The UIF payment is, you could say, that's surplus money that has had to be laid out. Yes, it's money that belongs to workers, but it's had to be laid out. And it's historic that so much money has had to be paid out way in advance. And what we made available to augment the social grants, to pay out the 350, is also new money, because we had to find money somewhere to augment. And augmenting our social grants was something that was welcomed by the pensioners, the children who get all these grants, and that has served, and people who are disabled, that has served us well. And so the stimulus package of 500 billion is quite a big ticket and has never happened in the history of our country. Could we have done more? Yes. What did I want? I wanted R1 trillion. I honestly wanted R1 trillion, but when we had to look at where the money would come from, we were constrained. And it was not for lack of imagination or lack of trying. We wanted to do the best for the people of our country. So you could say, yes, between a rock and a hard place, that's exactly where we were. Has the issue, you say go big or go broke, and I would like to believe that we have gone big, much bigger than we would ever imagined. To lay out 100 billion rand for mass employment is quite a big number. For job protection and for job creation, of course we need more. Right now where I am, I wish we could lay out R1 trillion, but we don't have that capacity. We don't have that sort of money. So we've got to make do with what we are going to have to do with. And of course, when we come up with our plan, there'll be more criticism, but we are going to have to cut the cloth, our coat, according to the size of the cloth that we've got. Has COVID brought the issue of public goods to the fore effectively? Yes, it has. And COVID moment has brought about a number of other new things that were never thought of in the world. I can tell you of one, the issue of the basic income grant. I was actually quite shocked when the Financial Times of London, in their editorial, said, because COVID has actually revealed great inequalities in the world, the basic income grant should now be considered. Now, this is your rabid capitalist type of newspaper that at least I never thought would lean more to the left and talk about a basic income grant. So the issue of public goods is a matter that has become very prominent, and it's a matter that we've got to be dealing with and actually saying, in order to reduce poverty, we've got to address things that we've always ordinarily thought that people should pay for. But how will they pay for it when they don't have the money? Like data for students, for instance. How are they ever going to be able to pay for data? And that is why the Minister of Higher Education negotiated with the mobile companies to seriously and heavily reduce the cost of data, and that was done for that period. But the public good issue has come to the fore, including, for instance, the issue of vaccines, the issue that Sophie also raises. Should the vaccine that is found and developed now be something that will be hogged by your more developed countries? The answer should be no. The vaccine that will be developed should be made available, should not be nationalized, as Sophie is saying, by your rich countries who have the capability and the firepower. It should be made available. Of course, there is a cost attached to it, but it should not be at a price where excessive profits are going to be made. Even a public good has got to be paid for in one form, shape, or another. And if we find it, we will, when it is found, we will want to get that vaccine, and we will have to make it available to our people. And we will want to regard it as a public good. But the whole process of acquiring it is something that we are going to negotiate, we are going to advocate and agitate for the pricing of those vaccines, not to be excessive. And I think the message is sinking in. From the African Union perspective, that is precisely the message that we are sending out. We're saying the whole continent of 1.2 billion people is going to be the second biggest market, possibly the third after China and India and us in Africa. And so therefore, we need to be at the table. We need to be talking more and more about access. And tomorrow we're going to have a World Health Organization event with a number of heads of states talking precisely about this. And the message that I am going to be putting forward as chair of the AU is that a vaccine has got to be made available to the African continent. We cannot accept that only the big developed economies should be the ones that hog the vaccine. And we also, by the way, have other capabilities in South Africa, because when the vaccine is finally perfected and available, we are going to manufacture it here. And we're going to make sure that we have the access that will be required. Janet says, how are we going to convince people tonight that things will be different? I'm hoping that, and I don't want to keep repeating this, there's been a lot of doubt, a lot of skepticism about what we've been seeking to do. And it took someone who did a full analysis of what has been done and achieved since the 6th administration got into office. There was a gentleman called J.P. Landman who did a write-up, and the type of write-up that even my publicity populist side would probably never have pieced together. But he did, and he said, when you look at the record, when you look at what has been achieved, you look at what's been done at the NPA, at SARS, and a number of places, you'll find that there has been a change. And in some cases, it's a sea change, because we were on a one-way ticket to total dysfunctionality. And we've been able to arrest some of those things, the bad things that were happening, and reposition. And I say, that is the record. And that is why I say history will absolve me, because one needs to look at what we are seeking to do. And when we do these things, we're not playing games. We're being very serious, and we're doing it in a painstaking manner. And some of it may be taking longer than what people wanted. But you know what? It took a number of years to have dysfunctionality in various state structures. And a number of them were broken piece by piece on an ongoing basis, and it took years. And of course, South Africans want to see everything repaired and done properly the very same day. But it has taken time. It will take time, but I'm hoping that when people see that there is a change and we are changing things, they will realize that we are serious. And it is this, Janet, that I think should convince people. We've never had a situation where we have put corruption under the spotlight like we are now, where government in all its various criminal justice institutions actually are working together. And where we are even saying we are looking forward to reviving certain structures that served us well, because we are serious about corruption. So COVID-19 took us to the depth of our despair. It took us to the lowest point. But we are saying COVID-19 and what we do about some of the degradation is what we should see as a game changer. And I see COVID-19 as a game changer in as far as fighting corruption and repositioning even our economy. Let us look at all these things in a very positive light. And I know sometimes it's tempting to be dismissive and say they've never been successful at implementing this and that. And I say, let us work together to reposition our country. And we can only do it if we work together, including with the media. And I think the media has a very positive role to play. You are playing a very positive role in revealing all these corrupt activities. But where something is being done properly, you need to also talk about it so that we do not just infuse a lot of gloom in the country where things are being done properly, or where there are sparks, where there is light at the end of the tunnel. Let us also look at that, and let us also talk about that, because that also encourages those who are seeking to do the right thing, And there's a wonderful book that a friend of mine referred to me, and he just took out one chapter. He said, one of the best ways of changing nations around is to back reformers, is to stand behind reform efforts, because by so doing, you egg them forward. You give them the strength that they need. We're not saying that there shouldn't be any criticism. There should be, of course there should be. Where we go wrong, where I go wrong, yes, there should be. But where we go, we do certain things right, and we should have that wind. There should be that wind, and it should be the wind behind the nation, the entire nation, that we're now focusing on putting things right. And I believe that COVID-19 has yielded that key moment for our country, that having gone to the depths of total degradation and despair, we should be able to rise like a phoenix from the ashes. And this is the moment that South Africa now has. Thank you very much.